A drunken policeman with a smug smile. He swung his baton at an old man. But what happened next was unbelievable. Seconds later, the policeman realized he had bumped into the wrong person. The late afternoon sun poured its golden hue over Santa Monica Pier, softening the edges of the day with that California glow that always seemed too perfect to be real. Families with ice cream cones ambled down the promenade. Seagulls soared overhead, and the ocean stretched endlessly into the horizon, crashing rhythmically against the pilings. Street performers danced. A saxophone sang a slow blues tune from the edge of the boardwalk, and the scent of kettle corn mingled with salt air. It was a typical day at the beach, full of life, noise, and movement. Except for one man who remained perfectly still. He sat on an old wooden bench, shaded by the fringe of a palm, removed just enough from the footpath to avoid being part of the flow. He wore a simple gray hoodie pulled low, a well-worn baseball cap, cargo pants that had seen better days, and sneakers dusted with sand. At first glance, he looked like any other older man enjoying a quiet moment. His hands, thick and calloused, rested atop a duffel bag. Occasionally, he'd dip into a small brown sack and scatter cracked corn along the pavement. The seagulls recognized him and fluttered close, hopping about at his feet. His presence was unassuming, deliberate. He didn't move much, didn't talk, didn't stare at his phone. He simply existed. That man was Sylvester Stallone. Not the Stallone people remembered from movie posters or action figures. This was a quieter, weathered man. A man who had learned to step away from the spotlight without needing a ceremony. He didn't walk like someone clinging to a legacy. He walked like someone who had finally found peace in the absence of attention. At 70 plus, he wasn't looking for a fight, and that, ironically, was what brought one to him. A few blocks up from the pier, Officer Derek Nolan was finishing his shift. 8 years into the Santa Monica Police Department, Nolan wore his uniform like armor and carried his authority like a hammer. Square jaw, buzz cut, thick arms pushing against the sleeves of his navy blue shirt. He looked every bit the image of a man who didn't like being questioned. He prided himself on command, on being respected, feared if necessary. He had built a reputation around the idea that non-compliance was just another word for guilt. It didn't matter if someone was a teenager with headphones or an elderly man with a walker. If you didn't respond quickly, you were automatically wrong in his eyes. That's why the man on the bench caught his attention. To Nolan, there was something off about a person who didn't move with the crowd, who sat too still, who didn't perform the acceptable motions of jogging, texting, reading, or at least pretending to be productive. It irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. A man just sitting, looking out at the ocean, feeding birds without a word? That was a challenge. A silent act of defiance against the world of urgency and uniformity. And Nolan, even at the end of a long shift, wasn't about to let it slide. He adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, stepped off the paved walkway, and approached the bench. His boots made heavy thuds on the concrete. As he got closer, he gave his baton a light tap against his thigh. Not threatening, not yet, but a signal, a message. A few bystanders glanced his way, mostly uninterested, but one man walking a Labrador slowed down, sensing the tension in Nolan's stride. The birds at Stallone's feet pecked happily, oblivious. "Excuse me," Nolan said, as he came to a stop, hands on his belt, voice low and firm. Stallone didn't look up. "Sir," Nolan repeated louder, with more force behind the word. Stallone dipped into his bag, scattered more corn. The birds fluttered around his boots. Nolan's fingers twitched. "You've been sitting here for a while," he said sharply. "Do you have ID on you?" Still no response. The silence felt intentional, even though Stallone's face, mostly hidden by the hood and cap, gave away nothing. Nolan's irritation flared. The disrespect was palpable, or at least he perceived it as such. In his mind, authority wasn't a conversation. It was a command. And right now, this old man was ignoring the script. "Sir," Nolan said again, stepping closer, "this is a public space. You can't just loiter here indefinitely." "I'm not bothering anyone," Stallone replied finally, his voice a gravelly calm that cut through the air without volume. Nolan blinked. The tone threw him. It wasn't argumentative. It wasn't even dismissive. It was worse. It was unaffected. "That's not for you to decide," Nolan snapped, stepping forward so his shadow fell directly over the man. "You've got no visible ID, no stated reason to be here. And now you're failing to cooperate. You need to get moving." Stallone looked up slowly. His eyes beneath the brim of his cap were steady and unshaken. "It's a public bench," he said plainly. "I'm sitting. That's still legal, right?" Nolan's jaw clenched. The response wasn't loud, wasn't confrontational, but it stripped him of power in the worst way. Quietly, rationally, like being called out with nothing to push back against. He stepped in closer. "You think you're clever? You think you're better than the law?" "I didn't say anything like that." "Then get up, show me your ID, or I'll make you." A few passers-by had slowed. A teenager with earbuds out, a mother holding her daughter's hand, a couple tourists standing near a churro cart. No phones yet, but attention was growing. Stallone's hand moved slowly again, reaching into the bag. Nolan tensed, but instead of pulling out ID, he scattered another handful of corn. The birds stirred and settled. That's when Nolan snapped. He raised the baton and slammed it down hard on the bench beside Stallone's leg. The wooden crack echoed. Several people jumped. The child nearby flinched. The seagulls scattered upward in a frenzy. Yet Stallone didn't even twitch. Nolan's face reddened. "You deaf? Or just disrespectful?" he growled. "I hear you fine," Stallone said. He turned his head to look at the officer. His voice remained quiet, the kind of quiet that carried weight. "You're angry because I'm not afraid of you." Something about that line hit deeper than Nolan expected. He gritted his teeth and stepped even closer. "You think you're untouchable, huh? That's what this is? You think just because you're old, I won't—" "You don't want to finish that sentence," Stallone interrupted, still seated, still calm. "You really don't." Nolan couldn't stop himself. In one angry swing, he brought the baton up and down, aiming for Stallone's shoulder, but it never landed. Stallone shifted, just slightly, a small lean, a half turn, and the baton cut through empty air. Before Nolan could recover, Stallone's hand caught his wrist, not with brute force, but with precision. It wasn't an attack. It was a hold, a message. Nolan froze. The strength was unmistakable, but more than that, it was controlled, deliberate. He tried to jerk back, but Stallone released him at just the right moment, letting the cop stumble a half step in retreat. A breathless silence fell between them. That was when the first phone was raised, and Officer Derek Nolan realized something had shifted. He didn't quite know what yet, but he knew this. He wasn't the one in control anymore. Officer Derek Nolan stood frozen for a heartbeat, his baton still raised, but now useless in the space between him and the man who had effortlessly avoided its blow. Around them, the murmurs of the gathering crowd were beginning to swell. Low voices of curiosity, concern, and quiet disbelief. The unmistakable shift of public attention that no uniform could silence once it gained momentum. His fingers tightened involuntarily around the baton's grip as his eyes darted toward the small ring of spectators who were no longer pretending not to watch. A couple of phones were definitely filming now. One young woman near the pretzel cart had already raised hers high above her head for a better angle. Another man in joggers was holding his sideways with a focused expression. Derek felt a flush of heat crawl up the back of his neck. He could feel control slipping, a slow but unmistakable unraveling that had begun the moment that old man looked him in the eye without blinking. He needed to re-establish authority, immediately. That's how things worked in situations like this. Presence, posture, tone. Those were the tools he had relied on for years. He had never needed more. People usually folded the moment he squared his shoulders and raised his voice. But this wasn't usual. This was something else entirely. And worse, he knew, somewhere beneath the growing adrenaline, that he had misread everything. Misread the man, misread the moment. But pride is a dangerous thing. And Nolan had built too much of himself on being the man in charge to back down now. He cleared his throat, tried to deepen his voice into the practiced bark that had always drawn compliance. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Put your hands behind your back. You're interfering with an officer and refusing to comply with a lawful order." Stallone, now standing but still composed, didn't react. He looked directly at Nolan, the same way a storm might look at a man yelling at the clouds. Calm, unmoved, but with something beneath the surface that promised consequences if pushed further. Nolan stepped forward again and reached out, intending to grab the man's wrist and force the issue. He had every intention of making it a clean, quick takedown, a textbook procedure. But the moment his fingers closed around Stallone's wrist, the world changed. It happened fast, but not chaotically. No shouting, no sudden flailing, just one smooth motion. Before Nolan could even tighten his grip, his hand was redirected. Not struck, not twisted, but moved, as if he had no choice in the matter. The baton clattered to the pavement. His body followed its lead, stumbling forward as Stallone's other hand shifted his balance. For the first time in years, Nolan felt not just outmaneuvered, but outclassed. It wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. He staggered back 2 paces, shaking out his wrist, now empty, now defenseless. The crowd gasped, and this time he heard the unmistakable shutter sound from one of the phones. Someone had switched to photo mode. The sound of it sliced deeper than the physical disarmament. This wasn't just happening. It was being documented. His mouth opened, and for a second, he considered saying something, anything, to reassert his control, but nothing came. His chest heaved slightly with each breath, the reality of the moment pressing down hard. His baton lay by his boot, but he didn't dare reach for it again. Instead, his hand moved instinctively to his holster, the service weapon, the last and ultimate authority. A dangerous line, one he never thought he'd feel tempted to cross in a situation like this. But his judgment was clouded, and humiliation burns hotter than logic. His fingertips brushed the grip of the firearm. That's when Stallone's voice cut through the chaos. Not loud, not angry, but so steady it sliced clean through everything. "Don't," he said simply. One word, no threat, just a suggestion laced with consequence. Nolan froze, torn between ego and instinct. He'd been in real danger before. Real shootouts, real chases, real armed suspects. But this didn't feel like those moments. This felt worse. Because this wasn't survival. This was being seen. Not by criminals, but by the very public he was sworn to protect. And in their eyes now, he wasn't the protector. He was the aggressor. And the man standing before him wasn't resisting. He was simply refusing to be bullied. Something about that balance of dignity and restraint shook Nolan to his core. He lowered his hand, stepping back with a forced exhale, as if releasing the breath would also release the panic clinging to his ribs. He looked at Stallone again, trying to see him through new eyes. And then it clicked. His posture, his timing, the way he moved, not with aggression, but with practiced ease. Not just a man who knew how to defend himself, but one who had been defending others long before Nolan ever pinned a badge to his chest. Recognition didn't come like a slap. It came like a slow, humiliating dawn. "Wait," someone whispered behind him. That's Sylvester Stallone, isn't it?" Another voice echoed, louder now. "Oh my God, that is him." The phones rose higher. Stallone said nothing. He didn't confirm or deny. He didn't gloat. He just stood there, hands relaxed, eyes calm, like a man who had dealt with far worse than the likes of Nolan. That's when backup arrived. Two officers jogged up from the end of the promenade. One young, one older, both already scanning the situation with sharp, trained eyes. The older one, a sergeant named Hal Whitman, slowed the moment he saw the scene. His gaze moved from Nolan to Stallone to the gathered crowd. He didn't ask questions right away. He didn't need to. He had seen enough in 20 years to read a room without a single word. Nolan turned toward them, desperate now, his voice rising in volume but cracking under strain. "He assaulted me. He resisted arrest. Put him in cuffs." Whitman didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Stallone. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but recognition. The lines around his mouth relaxed slightly, and his hand dropped away from his holster. "You all right, sir?" Whitman asked Stallone, his voice low but respectful. Stallone nodded once. "I'm fine." The younger officer glanced nervously between Nolan and Whitman, unsure where to stand. The crowd murmured. Nolan's pulse thundered in his ears. "Sarge, are we going to just—" he started, but Whitman raised a single hand, silencing him. "Derek," he said flatly. "Just the name? No rank? No instruction?" But it landed like a verdict. Nolan stood stiff, face red, fists clenched. The word had hung in the air like a blade. He opened his mouth again, but the weight of the moment, of all the eyes, of the cameras now pointed in every direction, had finally sunk in. There was no climbing out of this, no rewriting what had just occurred. Whitman turned to him fully, voice even but firm. "Badge and weapon," he said. Nolan flinched. "Sarge, come on, this is—" "Now." There was no heat in the command, only finality. The younger officer looked away, embarrassed for him. The crowd hushed, holding their breath as Nolan reached for the badge clipped to his chest and pulled it free with stiff fingers. It felt heavier than it ever had. He handed it over, followed by the sidearm, ejected, cleared, and offered like a confession. Whitman took them both without a word. "Walk him out of here," he told the rookie, who stepped forward, not roughly, but decisively. As Nolan turned to leave, the weight of 100 silent judgments pressed against his back. Phones followed his every step. Faces showed a mixture of satisfaction, discomfort, even pity. He didn't look back. He couldn't. And somewhere deep in the pit of his stomach, he knew what had really happened. He hadn't just lost control. He'd been exposed, unmasked, and all it had taken was a man too old, too quiet, and too wise to bother fighting back. As Officer Derek Nolan was led away from the pier, the sound of his boots scraping against the pavement was barely audible over the wind and the waves. Yet in his ears, it sounded like a drumbeat of disgrace. The badge that had once been the symbol of his authority, clipped proudly to his chest for years, was now gone. The weapon that once gave him a false sense of finality in any confrontation now rested in someone else's hands, cold and unneeded. And the eyes? That was the worst part. Eyes everywhere, watching, judging, recording. People didn't whisper now. They didn't need to. Everything they needed to say had already been caught on film, and the narrative was already forming without him. There would be no defense, no statement, no spinning of what had just happened. He'd gone after an old man. No, not just any old man, but a man who had once defined what it meant to stand for something. And he hadn't just lost his temper. He had revealed something much worse: his contempt for those he underestimated. Back on the boardwalk, the crowd lingered, not out of bloodlust, but from the pull of something unspoken. Sylvester Stallone stood quietly at the edge of it all, not basking in attention, not acknowledging the phones or the whispers. He didn't wave or speak or explain. He simply bent down, picked up the scattered bag of corn that had been knocked over in the scuffle, and returned to the bench. The birds, as if sensing the calm had returned, fluttered back down. He scattered a handful again with the same slow, practiced motion, and for a brief moment time seemed to soften. The tension unraveled into the breeze. The children laughed again somewhere in the distance. The saxophone player, who had gone silent during the confrontation, began to play once more, a soft, steady melody that drifted like smoke into the air. And then, just as easily as it had risen, the crowd began to break apart. The sergeant, Hal Whitman, stayed a moment longer. He walked over, not with stiffness, but with the cautious respect of someone who had served long enough to recognize when he'd witnessed something rare. "Mr. Stallone," he said, almost hesitant, as if unsure whether the name still belonged to the man before him. Stallone glanced up but said nothing. Whitman cleared his throat. "What he did, that's not how we operate. At least, it's not how we're supposed to." Stallone gave a nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. "You didn't need to explain that," he said. "You were here. That's what matters." There was no anger in his voice, no indignation, no vengeance, just weariness, the kind that came from living long enough to know the cycle repeats itself, that every generation has to learn some lessons the hard way. Whitman stood in silence, watching as another handful of corn left Stallone's palm and scattered across the pavement. "You handled it better than I would have," he finally muttered. Stallone gave a small shrug. "There's a difference between power and control. I've had both. I know which one's more dangerous." The sergeant nodded slowly, digesting the weight of that line. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. "You ever need anything, you let me know?" Stallone didn't respond. He just kept feeding the birds. Somewhere down the street, Nolan was being driven back to the station. Not in cuffs, but far more restrained than if he had been. The drive was silent. The rookie officer beside him didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Nolan sat stiffly, eyes fixed on nothing, watching his career and reputation dissolve mile by mile. He thought about what he would say in the report, what excuse might soften the blow. But there was no version of the truth that could hide what had happened, and deep down, he knew it. He wasn't suspended because he lost a fight. He was suspended because he tried to win one that should have never started. Back at the pier, the energy had shifted. The incident had become part of the background noise already. Tourists returned to their ice cream. Joggers passed through the scene like ghosts. A couple argued over directions. But for those who had witnessed it closely, who had felt the tension, seen the baton, heard the silence between two men, something lingered. They would carry it home, retell it at dinner tables, share the footage online. Some would caption it with outrage, others with awe. But all would remember the moment when an old man refused to be diminished, not by anger, not by force, not even by the weight of a badge. Stallone, for his part, stayed seated. He didn't seek to explain what had just happened. He didn't look for a camera or give a speech. He simply existed in the stillness he had earned, not as a man trying to prove something, but as one who had nothing left to prove. He had played heroes, trained for wars on screen, stood before cheering crowds and blinding lights, but none of it had given him what he had found now, clarity. This bench, this moment, the simple act of feeding birds under a warm California sun was more honest than any stage he'd ever stood on. Nearby, a father knelt beside his young son, who had witnessed the confrontation and was now looking toward the bench, curiosity brimming in his wide eyes. "Dad," the boy asked, "who was that man?" The father hesitated, then smiled. "That was someone who used to play heroes, and today reminded us what one really looks like." The boy looked again, watching as another gull landed and pecked happily at the sidewalk. He didn't understand the full story, not yet, but he would remember the feeling, the hush, the shift, the way even grown-ups had looked quietly amazed. As the sun dipped lower over the horizon and the light turned from gold to amber, Stallone stood, slowly, deliberately. He brushed off the seat, slung the duffel bag over his shoulder, and gave one last handful of corn to the birds who, for all their noise, had remained the most peaceful part of the day. He walked without urgency, his steps steady, his shoulders loose. He passed by a few people who now recognized him, not with screams or selfies, but with nods of quiet respect. A woman with silver hair placed a hand over her heart as he walked by. A young man, holding his skateboard, simply said, "Thank you," though even he didn't know exactly for what. At the edge of the boardwalk, Stallone paused, looked out at the ocean for a long moment, then continued on, disappearing into the flow of everyday life as easily as he had arrived. No one followed. No one dared interrupt. The legend had not been in the fight. He had stopped one. And sometimes the most heroic thing a man can do is not rise to violence, but stand in the face of it with nothing but stillness. Behind him, the pier returned to its rhythm. The sun sank into the Pacific, and the bench he left behind sat empty, carrying the memory of a moment that had said more about character, justice, and dignity than 100 speeches ever could.